Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Security Amplified. My name is Kamal Shah. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Profit Security, and thank you for joining us today. My guest is David Tsao. David Tsao is currently the CISO of Notion. Prior to Notion, he was the CISO at Instacart, and he's held senior security and leadership roles at Marqeta, Viva Systems, and Gilead Sciences. He's also a venture advisor at Wild Ventures and a founding member of SVCI. So, David, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Kamal.
Great to have you. So, look at your background and your career, David. One of the things that stands out is that you have a very unique career arc, and you've led security teams at companies in four different industries. Pharma at Gilead, FinTech at Marqeta, marketplaces at Instacart, and now SaaS at Notion. So, I guess to kick off the conversation, how is security the same or different across these four industries?
So, what is the same? I'd say it's like we all have the similar threat actors going after whatever our key assets are. But to your point, what's been really interesting is the differences where certain companies like Gilead were much more focused around process, much more around operational excellence, and not as much, unfortunately, around like what I would say engineering capabilities versus the tech companies. Obviously, it's typically the inverse. You want to disrupt, you want to be much more innovative. And it's just been interesting to see where in the spirit of being disruptive and innovative, sometimes there's actually a lot of inefficiencies that they have to overcome that the more mature companies have already solved for. So the challenge, if anything, is like how to bridge the best of both worlds and try to carry through those different lessons learned.
Fascinating. Now, Notion is a fantastic company. I love the product. We have millions of people that use it to store their most sensitive thinking, organize their documents, help standardize processes. And now AI is being woven into the product. So, how does Notion think about AI and leveraging AI to deliver better outcomes to its users?
From a product or company perspective, it's really how to leverage all the different knowledge and systems of record that exist across different companies' systems and make that like the easiest to pull insights out of and to take action on. But within the company, it's actually been interesting because being very much AI first, AI native, all of our roles have essentially changed as well, myself included. And we talk about this where even like engineering managers now, we're all tech leads essentially. So there's been a massive learning opportunity as we dog food. How do we ourselves get better at managing knowledge and using AI to accelerate our own business?
And in that vein, how do you think about security for Notion as you use AI?
We've tried to use it, wherever possible and run a lot of different experiments in that. So the very first use case that we came up with was essentially a security response incident bot or like a triage bot. And I've had a lot of great success in that place. We had a blog post about this and we call it a product called Scruff. We made it available for free actually. So it's in the Notion marketplace. Anyone can go ahead and just download it. It's a bunch of prompts basically. So there's really not a whole lot of magic into it, but we found that's reduced our investigation time from hours to minutes, reduced our false positive rate from like 33% when we were doing this manually to less than 7%. And over time, when we've gone back, we found about 85 to 90% of the decisions made by that one bot aligned to what an incident responder would have done as well. So we have human alignment that's actually very high. So it's quite effective. And this was all just with essentially like a 2-page set of prompts. Now, the orchestration harness, the integrations that exist, that's a little more work, but definitely shows the potential. And we've since done a lot of different experiments around a vulnerability factory, around detection workshops that really help us to continue to apply that same pattern.
Love the innovation from your team. And I love that you're a team of builders and engineers that are building solutions leveraging AI. Now, it's clear that AI is going to have a massive impact on security across the board. We've seen this even in the public markets when cloud first announced cloud security, and we've had large companies market caps go down by 30, 40%. And so it's clear that AI is going to have a massive impact. And as we talk about AI and security, we have to start with Mythos, right? So, from your perspective, what are the implications for Mythos in the short and long term?
The famed Mythos, yes. I think there's been quite a few experts that have spoken about this probably better than I have. I think there was a well respected vulnerability researcher that gave a talk recently at Unprompted that essentially said that LLMs or AI can do at least as good a job, if not better, than a vulnerability researcher can themselves. And so just looking at enabling that raw capability across not just specialists, but essentially anyone that has that interest leads us to what Anthropic, I think, describes as a world where there's AI driven offense that's currently outpacing AI driven defense. And so that makes it especially challenging. I think the past 2 months have for any tech company, any company out there, I think, has been very challenging because of that. So I think in the longer term, the theory is whether or not Mythos itself can do certain incredible things, that the cascading effect down, especially to the open weight model world, where if that becomes available over the next year, poses a significant risk to all of our companies, because now it's not just the people that are willing to pay and can be vetted and like trusted white hat testers, but now though that power can be in the hands of real threat actors. And so that's essentially what I think we're all concerned about.
Absolutely. And we're also seeing security teams highlight the fact that today a lot of conversation around Mythos is focused on vulnerabilities, but
Mhm.
at some point it's going to shift to say, hey, it's going to be beyond vulnerabilities, and Mythos will be used to also launch attacks across beyond just vulnerabilities, right? And so the fear is that a seasoned attacker will be able to leverage technologies or capabilities like Mythos to
Mhm.
10x the speed and velocity of attacks.
100% agree with that. So if we look at our own stats internally, frankly, it used to take us way, way too long a year ago to burn down a vulnerability. And now our average in this past several months has been single digit days. Even that's actually too long, right? We're going to have to get down to using automation and agents to cut that down to the hours of minutes and hours to discover, test, patch, deploy. And then, exactly to your point, because of the amount of vulnerabilities that we have, all of these companies essentially have tech debt, right? If you think about especially third party dependencies that we've all been using, especially open source ones, it originally sped up our ability to deliver. But now those third party dependencies are a liability to all of our tech stacks. And so, like, where are those vulnerabilities and how can we quickly find them? And obviously, there's been a lot of efforts made. IBM announcing, I think, their $4 billion investment. And I think Jen Easterly asking for Frontier Labs to, contribute money, right, to do that type of research. But even so, certainly on the detection and response side are areas that we're also making much more investments in as well.
Speaking of which, what in your mind will be the impact of AI on red teaming? Or, said it differently, how will red teaming evolve with AI?
So I'll share an anecdote where we get a chance to meet with a lot of different startups, not just myself, but people on my team. The number of founders that have come to us and have said they are the best red teamers, they have the black badges, they have achieved a certain level of sophistication, and they've imbued their knowledge into agents, and that is their moat. We look at this and say, wait a second, it's more than single digits, essentially, of these number of companies that are making these claims. And I'm sure they have some special sauce, but if just that sheer volume of claims are being made, there's got to be something there that's real. And then the expectation where, wow, probably there is a decent world where LLMs can be incredibly powerful at red teaming. We've seen some of this, we suspect, around even like open source based LLM harnesses like Neurosploit and others. The current state is they're very noisy. So that's the silver lining, is that currently it's easier to detect those fairly sophisticated, or at least fairly persevering types of attacks. But I'm sure the time will come where they're not going to be so noisy. And then that's going to be even harder for us to detect. So that's where we're trying to make those investments now on the detection side.
Makes perfect sense. You talked about detection and response. That conversation around that starts with a SIM. And so I would love your thoughts on how will AI change the SIM market as we know it today? Right? Will they survive in its current form, or is the future of a SIM a a security data lake or some other incarnation with an AI layer on top for detection and response?
My impression here is like the reasons that SIEM came into existence were we didn't have an easy way to process like raw events, and we needed an easier way for incident responders to use them. But I remember talking with some very sophisticated incident responders that were dealing on very large cases, and they said whenever they would land at a company or client site, they wouldn't even bother looking at the SIEM. Like they would go straight to the raw logs. And so the challenge is SIEM, traditionally at least, you have a lot of transformation, right? You're abstracting things away. So it may be useful to look for certain patterns and correlation, but when you're actually trying to find that needle in the haystack, it doesn't seem like it's actually the place to go to. And if anything, we've seen patterns where Notion is an example. Like we make our audit logs available to certain customers. Like if you're at enterprise level, we'll ship you those logs. Our customers have the same challenge of, well, what does that log entry actually mean? Like, what does that event do? And so you have to now go back and understand all that business context and reconstruct it. So, what we're actually experimenting with is let's use an agent internally that understands our business rules, our business logic, and then as an incident responder, you just tell us, what are you concerned about over this period of time or these types of patterns or whatever it might be. And then the agent has to now use all of its internal context, which is kept up to date and current, right? And it's, I think, going to be much more effective. So my suspicion is it's going to be truly that agent to agent type of interaction in the future, where you're going to have each of your SaaS providers that are generating all these events should also be accountable for understanding what events are really significant or of interest versus trying to just push that all on to the customers to try to figure that out.
So, in this world, David, do you envision that there's no centralization of all those logs into one place and you have multiple data sources of logs and you have agents that go through and do the detection or correlation on demand to identify certain patterns or to investigate a alert from one data source or to do threat hunting?
I still think there's going to be a lot of value in that, right? And for sure, just for forensics purposes, I'm sure like any company will want to have a copy of all those raw logs to confirm all of their findings because you can't really just assume that each of your vendors is doing it correctly. But that's probably for later in this incident response process. For the initial kind of detection, alerting, triaging, enrichment, trying to identify where is the bleeding and how do you stop the bleeding. My suspicion is it's all going to be upstream of that. And so, yes, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of value in threat hunting. The other benefit is you're going to have access to so much more data, right? So, if anything, that's been the interesting like obstacle that AI has pushed us to. Historically, security would always say we want to see all the data, but there was always some hesitance around, well, do you really get to see everything? Yes or no? But now, because of the perceived productivity benefit of AI, we're going to give AI access to all the data for productivity reasons. And then we actually have a secondary benefit where security can leverage it as well.
Just building on that and focusing on the impact of AI around security operations. Today, as you know, many organizations outsource or partly outsource security operations to the MSSP MDR market. And we've seen some acquisitions in the space. Zscaler bought a company about a year ago. But how do you think AI will impact the MSSP MDR market, right? Which, according to Gartner, is a massive market. Companies today are spending north of $86 billion on managed security services. So, how does AI impact that massive market?
Disruption. Essentially, you're going to redirect all those dollars over to the frontier labs and make fewer companies, I guess, very wealthy. So, what I mentioned earlier around the vulnerability factory, detection workshops, and then Scruff, the AI SOC triage bot, right? Each of those has been very useful at helping us to identify vulnerabilities. In the vulnerability factory example, it actually will go through, look at all the different targets, reproduce the vulnerability, craft the PR as a test, reproduce the test. Like it'll do most of the work up to the point where then a human can review the final PR and give essentially, their final human in the loop approval. But that saves a massive amount of time. And we're planning to open source that, right? We're planning to open source all this stuff basically. So if you extend that same model to the detection workshop, well, in that case, a lot of times in prior lives, we would bring on an MSSP not only to deal with the sheer volume and noise of incidents that are or alerts that are coming in, but also to help give us like, well, what are the key detection rules that they're using across all the different customers? I remember, I think it was, Palo Alto and the Cortex MDR, like they have their core set of rules, right, that they monitor for each of their customers. It's like, well, let's just learn from that versus trying to recreate that from scratch. Well, with this in-house detection workshop, we can essentially craft all the customized rules automatically. That bot just runs. It's a series of agents that runs 24/7. And then the same thing I would expect to be true for reviewing alerts. And that's what the Scruff was the very first use case, right, that we started using. And the speed at which it can do the enrichment, do the verification, do the right triaging and classification, it's so fast. So yes, we'll still have humans that'll have to review and kind of say like, yeah, indeed, that does need to page someone, wake them up or something. But I do expect that to be significantly shoved over to having AI do most of that work.
Yeah. No, and that's precisely our value proposition, right? So Profit AI SOC analyst, or Profit AI's agentic AI SOC platform, which includes the analyst capabilities, plus the threat hunting capabilities, plus the detection capabilities, is exactly what you just outlined. And it's for companies that maybe not have the resources to take an open source project like Scruff and try to implement it in-house. And the results are quite compelling compared to the human-led offerings from the MDR MSSP vendors. And I suspect that some of them will embrace AI and transform their business. But for many of them, as you said, it's likely going to be disruption.
Wouldn't be surprised. Yep. I can give you like another example where we're seeing, because you have access to all data and now you actually can do something about it, right? It's no longer the case where you would have a backlog of alerts and you would just kind of get through the top 30 to 40 per, incident responder per day. Now we're in the position we're experimenting to see, well, if can we get a line of sight to any like deep and dark web breach announcements for any of our customers, because then they're going to be reaching out to us to help them. And the sooner we can get a line of sight to that, like the faster we can help our impacted customers, right? And there's been a couple in the news that recently where at least the rumor has been, before the incident was publicly announced, if you went back to those breach forums, you would have found the announcements being made at least several weeks beforehand. So it's like the data is there. You can try to get more line of sight to what the threat actors are doing to a certain extent. And then what are we going to do with that? How do we be more proactive?
When you build the solutions yourself and you have capabilities, and obviously there is a pricing element here that varies based upon usage. So how do you think about token pricing? And we've seen some headlines recently where companies have used up their token budget for the year in the first few months of the year, and there is a risk of that happening, right? When you try to put something together, how do you manage that? And the reason I asked this question is because when we offer those capabilities as a product, there are a lot of tooling and infrastructure that we have built in to make sure that the product is scalable, is reliable. We can take new models. We have an evals framework. So there's a lot of harness and tooling that you have to build around it to make sure it's enterprise grade, and it's also predictable from a pricing standpoint, and costs don't run out of hand.
Yeah. So there's, I think, a lot of opportunities for cost optimization. Even today, we're still trying to figure out what are the true potential and power of different models. Like my journey, I just joined Notion, as you know, in November. So I've had somewhat of an accelerated onboarding into how to use AI in this company. And so, I went from kind of the single player state of using Cursor with having AI side by side in the IDE, to then the classic, oh, you have Claude Code, you have Codex, and interacting with that as a single player mode, to the latest versions that we're working with. The vulnerability factory is one example. And publicly, we've also talked about the software factory as a generic solution to this. You essentially have a multiplayer approach. And actually, you don't directly interact with the coding harnesses anymore. So when you start to introduce certain techniques like, hey, instead of having like very long sessions, you start to build up massive context windows. And sure, with Claude Code and its million context window makes it super easy to just keep going and going, right? But when you begin to chunk up that work, you have subagents, you have memories that they write out to, and then you loop those together, you're actually able to have it run with much smaller context windows, much lower costs each time. Plus, if some of these types of work you can kind of anticipate up front are not as sophisticated, there's been various solutions out there, right, that'll try to route the prompt to a cheaper model without losing any of the quality and so forth. So I think the challenge is you have to have the right orchestration harness to manage the different providers for model providers for you to figure out like what you're doing. And then because you don't have to interact with the coding harnesses directly and for like for these long running jobs, you're not worried about having disparate, agents, MD files all over the place that are loading tons of context for every single prompt that you load in. So I think that you turn off fast mode. I mean, there's certain multipliers that you can significantly cut down the cost, and it's just a setting, and people don't necessarily realize it. At the same time, we're continually evaluating open weight models as well. And if it's not a huge surprise. This has been, I think, fairly well documented. But if you look at that trajectory of where the Minimaxes and Kimmys and DeepSeeks of the world are getting towards, as I mentioned, not my opinion, others' opinions over the next maybe around a year timeframe, those capabilities are going to be essentially close to what the acclaimed Mythos is going to be able to do at presumably a fraction of the price. And so, plus all the hardware disruption that's happening with Cerberus and Thales and others, where now these things can compute hundreds, if not thousands, of tokens a second. We're still in this early days where things can be very inefficient, but there's so many ways you can not only streamline cost but also improve performance.
Yeah, exciting times indeed. The pace of innovation is just so hard to keep up with. And it's a challenge for a software company, an AI native software company like us. I can only imagine what it is for companies where their primary business is not, doing what we do, not focused on security. Let's talk a little bit about the dreaded word autonomous, right? There's a lot of debate about, can we get to an autonomous SOC, or will some form of human in the loop always be needed, right? We've had some folks that have said, hey, in 2 years, we'll get to a place where a Fortune 500 company will run the SOC with one person. And then we have some folks that said, no, you'll always need a human in the loop to provide judgment that's often necessary. So how do you think about that in terms of, those two options, or will we end up somewhere in between?
The world where AI driven defense will be that efficient is still a little ways out. Unfortunately, I wish we could get there sooner just because we have to be able to counter the AI driven offensive capabilities. My sense is for security incidents specifically, it's going to take a very long time for that to potentially happen. And the main reason is you have a human adversary. Even if the human adversary is going to be using AI more and more on their side, ultimately it's still human versus human. And the creativity it still remains a bit unmatched. Like it's hard to take that out of the equation, right? So if you look at a more basic example of a non-security incident, let's say there's an outage, a bug, right, in your source code, we know of various companies today that have series of agents that will do root cause analysis, do the testing, do the isolation, craft the PR. And then by the time the on-call engineer wakes up and is figuring out what's going on in the middle of the night, the PR is ready for them to go. That's the human in the loop approval, right? But like you condense what normally would have taken all that time down to that final step. And that's in a scenario where essentially you have a deterministic, let's say assume a deterministic root cause. Because security, I don't anticipate to always be deterministic. So that's where I think you'll have to have humans. It's just the speed at which the adversaries and threat actors are using AI is obviously going to speed that up. But until you can clearly discern what the real sophisticated ones are, it's going to be difficult, I think, for AI to have a completely automated defense. I wish that day would come, but I'm not a futurist. So it's hard to tell. I can't predict anything, anything further than a year out, let's say, but at least not for the next year.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think it's exactly what we are seeing, right? There are certain types of incidents where it is deterministic. We have a high confidence that something is malicious. And with Prophet AI, you can go in and not only come up with that analysis and that determination in minutes, but also go and take remediation actions, like whether it's isolate the host or reset the password. And then there are cases where you still do all the analysis. So when you do page somebody with the security incident, or whether you have running a 24/7 SOC and you see that all the work is done. So what would take 60 minutes, 90 minutes to do, it's already done in a few minutes. And then you can apply that human judgment. And if there is remediation or actions needed, you can quickly do that through one click, right? So I think it's very hard to apply a blanket answer because it
Mhm.
depends on the type of a security incident and
Yeah.
the level of sophistication, and also the level of confidence that we have in making sure that something is truly malicious or not.
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome. Continuing on, when you think about a SOC, and you mentioned Graph, which is an open source solution that you have built, and when you look at the effectiveness of those solutions, what are some key metrics that you track, and how does that vary from the before state versus the after state? And perhaps you can also speak to it, given your experience at Instacart, where you did buy an AI SOC platform versus building it yourself.
Yeah, so some of the key metrics that the team looked at, and actually some of this started, before I joined, right? But we look at investigation time, time to resolution. We look at false positive rates, as well as, especially if the agent is doing it, like the human versus agent agreement, to see how good the agent is. So we can go, we do that look back, almost like a mini retro. And so that's where I mentioned before, right? Like 93% faster resolution, 30% analyst satisfaction, increased analyst satisfaction because they don't have to deal with so much noise. They're able to just take action now when they get all the key data that they need, and reducing that false positive rate from 1/3 down to single digits. And that was just like the V1 version of Scruff. And there's been internal conversations like, should we do V2? But we were kind of tackling some other problems at the moment. So there's tons of opportunity. I think probably your product has obviously invested, or your company has invested way, way more in this, and probably do this in much more maturity and capability than our simple bot can do. But it just gives you a taste of like, oh, there's definitely something here. It's worth
Yeah.
exploring.
Yeah, obviously it's evolved over time, and this has been a 2.5 year journey for us, David. But we're at 98.5% consistency with human
Wow.
determination,
See,
and
nice.
and what we find is that when we start working with a customer, it's in the low 90s, but then there
Mm.
is certain organizational context that
Mhm.
is sometimes missing, and so those investigations can benefit from customer provided guidance, whether it's organizational
Mhm.
policies or, hey, we're doing a
Yep.
pen test. So anything you see from pentest.instacart.com or pentest.notion.com domain, for this
Yep.
month, be
Yeah.
wary of that. And so that's context that's taken into consideration. And with
Mhm.
that context, which we call guidance, we've been able to increase that up to 98.5%.
Wow.
And the remaining 1.5% is inconclusive, where it truly needs human judgment, because we
Mhm.
just don't have the right information, or the agents don't have the right information to make a determination with high confidence.
Mhm. But still that's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah, the future is so bright, and by the way, this has evolved dramatically, and I think we'll get to a point where we can get to the 99 plus percent.
Mhm.
And the key is, making sure that you're looking at the confidence level of those
Mm.
determinations to make sure that you reach the right conclusion. And in security, we always want to be more conservative
Yeah.
than aggressive. Maybe a radical question here, David, but given what we just talked about, if you think about the future, what is the future of the SOC? I mean, do traditional tiers like level one, level two, level three matter? Will they still exist, or does it become something different?
I think the surface level answer, or what I mean by that's like the theoretical answer is like, okay, well, if you don't need a human for tier one, all that automation can be done using AI. But then the question becomes, well, number one, what skill sets do we need? Which is likely someone that has seen more sophisticated incidents at scale. And then how did they even get that experience to know when you have that more sophisticated adversary on the other side? And so if we don't have the career path and training and education, we're going to have a depleted or decreasing labor pool to try to work with, which would be a disaster, right? So I think there's going to be a combination where, yes, the core brunt work of it can be automated away, but then we need to probably focus around simulations, around cross knowledge, collaboration, and sharing. Our founder Ivan has talked about the potential for AI to free up and take away the busy work from our lives so that then we can do our life's best work and whatever it is for our passions. And I think on one hand, it's super easy to, when you start using AI, to just pour all that free time into AI because you kind of get that dopamine hit back of, wow, this is so cool what I can do. And we've spent a lot of time trying to ensure within our own teams, we don't only do that, but we set aside time for face to face collaboration, face to face learning. Because if we're all becoming experts in different domains, but we don't find ways to share it, like there's still siloing, there's still inefficiencies. And so I think that is still the human side of the answer around how do we ensure our detection and response teams continue to scale up, become more powerful, it's not simply, oh, a cost efficiency play, right? It would free us up to be able to really dig into, like, threat hunting can now be a very early stage capability that we can all have, right? And you can go on through that list. So I think I'm excited about that opportunity. It's just we have to make sure that we don't like jump the shark and try to like, oh, let's just cut costs and that's the only emphasis, when it really comes down to knowing our adversaries are becoming more sophisticated. Like, how do we find ways to build up our teams to prepare for that?
Yeah, we talk about it as eliminating the manual, repetitive tasks so
Mhm.
that you can focus on security work that truly matters. And the other way we talk about this, David, it's about role elevation, not role elimination, right?
Yeah.
And when you think about it, nobody goes into security wanting to be a level one, level two analyst for the rest of their life, right?
Yeah.
There's a learning curve there, and you learn a lot doing that. But can we accelerate that with AI? And can we advance their careers faster with AI? And the
Yeah.
end result is not just better careers and greater career satisfaction
Mhm.
and less burnout, but also delivering better security outcomes for your organization.
100% agreed.
A couple more, and then we'll dive into some rapid fire questions.
Sure.
AI is clearly making attackers go faster, right? We talk about phishing kits, we talk about deep fakes, we talk about autonomous reconnaissance. Do you think defenders are actually ahead or behind the curve right now?
Oh, that's easy. We're behind, right? I think broadly speaking, everyone's behind. I think a lot of this stems from on the product side of tech companies, and actually all companies essentially have technology behind them, that the source code essentially has tech debt that we've accumulated for the past several decades that we're now going to have to pay. And so, until we get to that point where that's addressed, and that is a massive undertaking to try to go through and fix, we're going to be continually responding to either vulnerabilities or attacks that are exploiting, right, those vulnerabilities. And so it's almost a world where you kind of have to get rid of most of your third party dependencies and write most things using first party code, and that's a huge amount of work. So we're seeing not just ourselves, but a lot of other peer companies right now just really prioritizing security and reliability, knowing that this kind of impending vulnerability apocalypse, or whatever you want to call it, is likely around the corner, because we have a little bit of leeway, but it's a very short runway that we have to try to do the best we can to shore up our defenses.
Yeah. So as we come up on time here, David, let's go ahead and end on a lighter note. So for a rapid fire round, first one, what's your favorite Notion template you actually use yourself?
So um, there's a one-on-one template doc that my EA actually created for me that just makes it so much easier when I have these one-on-one conversations. But actually, it's less around templates and it's more around like custom agents that we have that are running. And so I've been having a blast building out. Like, the team actually built the core of our vulnerability factory, but now trying to figure out what are the more sophisticated techniques and tactics that we can add into it and fold into it, and it's all leveraging these harnesses, right? That's actually been a lot more fun than like interacting with Notion on its own.
Love it. Any security tool you expect to be phased out or obsolete in the next 2 to 3 years because of AI?
I'm sure there's a huge gamut. I think the the one way I look at it is mostly from a budget and cost perspective, right? So it's like, yes, there's always the threat that we could try to build some, poorer version of a security tool, but it's really not our competitive advantage. So where possible, would prefer not to do that if the security company can, continue to be innovative, build with quality, and so forth. But now the cost equation is like way lower than ever before, so it doesn't make sense to pay such large amounts.
Yeah. What's your favorite beverage of choice?
So it's hojicha, which is it's similar to matcha or green tea, but it's like a more, I don't know, smoky or weedy type of flavor, and so that type of tea is absolutely delicious.
And last question, what have you recently read or listened to that you'd recommend to our listeners?
Oh man. I actually don't get a chance to like read full form books or things like that. I'm a little ashamed to admit that. It's mostly been, I hate to say this as well, using AI, and then like it being my little personal tutor of how to learn how to use all these different tools that are, as you said, continually evolving and growing. So trying to keep up, trying to learn all the different latest techniques, of what this looks like, the hands-on experience kind of beats the academic learning in that case.
Thank you so much, David, for joining us. It's been a blast. And I think you articulated some really great points on the impact of security, impact of AI on security. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and share. We'll see you next time.
Great.
Cheers.
Thank you so much. Bye.